You can drop all of the pins in the world that you want in certain places that you think there will be. But if you don't know why a mule deer chooses a ridge or a basin or a bench, then your hunt is just a guessing game in reality. So let's go ahead and fix that. Welcome back to Mapping Muleys Part 2, where we're diving into really how mule deer use terrain, how they use it for bedding, feeding, escape, and how those areas will change over the season as well. Um, this is brought to you by Wildeside Outdoors. Of course, I'm always going to start this with a caveat of this is how I do it. Um, there's probably people that know a heck of a lot more than I do that do it a different way, but this is what I've found success in, and I've made it very simple. Um, so let's dive in. As I highlighted in part one, there's three things that I look for: bedding, feeding, and escape routes. Um, and then kind of a fourth point that's more of a different topic for a different day is glassing points for those certain areas. So first one, let's dive into bedding. So really what I look for is north facing or northeast northwest facing slopes that allow the deer to have really good shade. Um, especially on those hot September days where the sun is really beating down, they can get into those north-facing slopes and get a little bit of relief from that sun. Usually, those are timbered. For the most part, those are timbered, especially in the mountain states in the west. But that's not the only thing I look for. I'm kind of thinking, okay, they really like to be on benches where it could be a mid slope, and then there's a bench, and then there's more slope. Um, there could be an escape route that they're close to. The other thing I like to think about as well is how can they have a thermal advantage? So, you can have a really long north-facing slope that allows the deer to be covered for most of the day, but they're not going to bed at the bottom of that slope. They're going to bed at the top of that slope so they can have that wind advantage during the whole day when it's warm and those thermals are rising up the canyon. So that's kind of like really what I think of is north facing, higher on that slope so they can have that thermal advantage, and then maybe a bench or two that's near an escape route, which we'll talk about more down the road. Second thing I think about is feed. And deer are pretty habitual. A lot of people don't scout elk, but they really scout deer because they're habitual. They go feed, then they go to bed, and then they come out back out to feed, and then they go to water, then they go back to bed, or some variation of that circle. So, um, really, what you're looking for is an an easy access in early morning and afternoons for these deer to go and feed in a really lush area that is close to their bedding. Doesn't have to be super close, but they're not going to travel a quarter, half mile every single morning and night to go feed. They're going to be bedding fairly close to where they're feeding, especially as we're in the early season with archery deer. Um, they're going to be in that routine of them, or I guess better said, that summer routine of them, kind of being lackadaisical, feeding often, really foraging for that really good dark green forage to kind of nurture antler growth and put on weight before the winter comes, essentially. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in terms of feed. And then kind of the third thing I'm thinking about is escape routes. If I'm in a basin that's cliffed out on all sides, I'm thinking, okay, this buck has to have a pinch point where if there's danger, a mountain lion, humans, hikers, hunters, anything, they can get out quickly. Um, Deer can climb some of those rock faces and be pretty good at it, but for the most part, I've found some of these small ridges, pinch points between, some of these finger spots. That's kind of what we're looking for here. That allows a deer to get out without having to, reveal themselves. Ideally, you want that to be in a spot where you're finding, the escape route is covered because they don't like to be visible when they're escaping. That's kind of one thing I found, and we'll kind of go through that here in a second on this example. So let's pull up the map here and we'll walk through this. So here we have this spot. It's a fairly popular deer spot, so I'll try to be discreet in this mapping here. But what I've done already is use GoHunt's terrain analysis feature, adjusted it to north, northeast, northwest. You can always mess with the elevation, slope angle. I think, for this circumstance, we could potentially take out, anything above 25 degrees here. Most likely deer aren't going to be betting on anything like that. Um, so it's kind of hard here. The shading of green is tough. Let me turn this up a little bit just so you can have an idea. So it's interesting, as you can see, like there's heavy timber in places that isn't just north facing. Um, and so, whoops, let's turn this down. Um, and so don't just think like, oh, timber is only on north facing slopes. Like, no, there's timber on south facing slopes too. It just depends on the weather, stuff like that. And so, um, let's dive into this little spot here. So we have kind of our north facing slopes here. Remember, we're kind of looking for north facing spots where they can kind of have a bench, with easy escape routes, can have good thermal advantage, etc. So, someone could argue, okay, like, have good shade and they're on north facing slope right here. That's not going to have any thermal advantage. Or they could have north facing slope and thermal advantage and be up here, but there's no shade. Just like a not a very logical spot for a deer to bed. So what I've seen here is typically these bucks are bedding, in these, believe it or not, in these strips of pines right here. So this allows, the deer to have access to this. Let me turn this back off. Have access to this basin for feeding. They have thermal advantage because they're up at the top of this basin. Any wind coming this way or up, they're gonna have that thermal advantage for any predators, etc. And then we're also going to have good escape routes here. So if they feel, pressure from up top, they can bust down this way. If they feel pressure from this way, they can blow out. I've seen it where they've been up feeding here, pressure comes from the bottom. They can quickly get into these trees, and be up and out of this country, before you know it. So, that's kind of, a good example of these three things that I'm looking for when e-scouting for mule deer in terms of terrain is good, feeding areas. Bedding has to make sense, and then escape routes up, down, across, for those deer to escape if they feel any pressure. Okay, it's kind of our key takeaways from part two of mapping muleys here. I just want to go over them quickly. One is don't just mark bedding because it's going to be a shaded area. Combine slope, cover, wind, and all those factors into a good bedding area. Number two is make sure your feeding areas that you're looking at have exits or escape routes. If they don't, those are what we're going to call dead zones, and we don't like deer aren't going to be there because they can't escape if there's danger detected. And as always, make sure you have a plan A, B, or C. Uh, there's factors outside of our control as hunters. We always have to be adaptable. So always make sure you have more than one plan and more than one area that you have e-scouted and could go in and potentially have success. But until next time, don't just mark pins, build systems. This is the wild side.